Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Lecture 14. Lecture 14 is a continuation of Lecture 13. And in Lecture 13, we did discuss models and modeling in economics. This is a continuation of our course, which is Philosophy of Science in Economics. I did give you a number of books, and I will not really go to the books now because you ought to have really looked out for them and probably tried to read some of those books. Now, if you recall in our previous discussion in Lecture 13, where we introduced the subject of models and the modeling in economics, we did cover the first part, and that is really the introduction. I introduced this topic. I took you through the nature of economic models, but more so looking at models as idealizations. We looked at idealization, we looked at de-idealization, and then, of course, the debate, the idealization versus de-idealization debate in econometrics, ladies and gentlemen. Right now, I want to take you to the second part that I was unable to cover, and that is models as constructions. And here, we are going to look at ideal types and caricatures. We are going to look at fictions and artificial systems, and we are going to look at constructed representations, and we shall be able to cover models as autonomous objects. And then, of course, later on we shall be moving on to working with models. But in this lecture, I'll really limit myself to models as constructions, and that's what we are going to look at, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah? Models as constructions. Right. Now, since we are discussing models as constructions, I just want to let you know that as an alternative to the ideas that models idealize, or models isolate, or models abstract some causal factors or mechanisms or tendencies of actual economies, it has been suggested that economic models are rather like pure constructions or fictional entities that nevertheless license different kinds of inferences. If you recall in the previous lecture, I did present issues of models in form of idealizations. So how we abstract reality out there, ladies and gentlemen, right? Now, remember, as we do that, we go through that process of idealization and de-idealize. And that's why in this lecture, we start by, again, interrogating some of those things, right? And that's an alternate, really an alternative idea, right? Models idealize, models isolate, models abstract some of those causal factors or events out there. And of course, at the end of the day, we want to interrogate and make meaning of those things, right? So, but we also know it has been suggested that economic models are also rather constructions, right? Constructions, or probably they are fictional entities, right? That license different kinds of inferences, right? And that's the kind of thinking that you find in literature, ladies and gentlemen. So there are several variations and variants of this option, which certainly differ from each other in the extent to which they nevertheless are committed to the representation status of models, and how much they pay attention to the actual construction process. So the construction process, as we said, is very complicated, but they must pay attention to a number of things. So models can be seen as constructions, right? So the constructedness of models has been associated with a number of things. One, a functional account of models as autonomous objects. And then number two, characterizing them or characterizing models in relation to target systems as either theoretical models or models of data, ladies and gentlemen. So that's why we are going to look at these different types of constructions, right? So we look at models as constructions. So in this next few seconds, I want to look at ideal types and caricatures, right? Now, as we have seen, idealization involves not just simplification or omissions, but also distortions and the addition of false elements, as we saw. When it comes to distortions in the social scientific context, right, scholars like Max Weber 1904 launched the famous idea of ideal types, right? And according to Max Weber, the ideal types present certain features in an exaggerated form, not just by accentuating those features left by omission of others. So remember, we are dealing with ideal types and caricatures. And Max Weber simply looks at ideal types, right? And to him, the ideal types present certain features, right? The features are there, but they are presented in an exaggerated form. And you need to bear that at the back of your mind, right? In an exaggerated form, right? Here we are not talking about those ones which are left out by omission, no, but the ones which are really abstracted, right? And they are the ones being constructed, but there is that element of exaggeration. So therefore, as a strategy to present, and by the way, in most cases, that exaggeration is seen as a strategy to present the most ideal form of the type. So there is always an exaggeration. So Weber regards both individual economic behavior and the market as viable subjects to consider as ideal types. So Max Weber thinks that you are going to talk about individual economic behavior and you're going to talk about the market. So these are viable subjects to consider as ideal types in which a certain kind of pure economic behavior might be defined. Now, of course, at the end of the day, when you use that as an ideal type, there is an element of exaggeration that will be obtained in the modeling process. So this kind of exaggeration appears again in Gibbard and Varian's 1978 idea of economic theory modeling being one of creating caricatures. So the person who promotes this concept of caricature is Gibbard and Varian's 1978 idea of economic theory modeling. And to them, this is one of creating caricatures. And the purpose of which is to allow economists to investigate a particular caricatured aspect of the model and thus to judge the robustness of the particular assumption that created such exaggeration, ladies and gentlemen. Now, this has similarities to the idea of a robustness analysis of core causal features, which I presented in the previous lecture as we went through the idealizations, the de-idealization, and then the idealization, de-idealization debate. So when you try to model, bring in those particular factors that seem to affect one another in a particular eventful process or system, and then you model, then you again pull out a few of those concepts and take them out of the model, and then the objective is to see how that model influences the other aspects within the model. I think that becomes very important. And that brings in the element of robustness analysis. So this concept of exaggeration, the issue of caricatures and so forth, has similarities to the idea of a robustness analysis of core causal factors. So that's why Morgan, 2006, interprets the caricaturing process as something more than the exaggeration of a particular feature. Rather, it involves the addition of features, pointing out to the constructed nature of the exaggeration rather than to it as an idealization, abstraction, or isolation of causal factors, ladies and gentlemen. So let's take as an illustration the Frank Knight's 1921 assumption that economic man has perfect information. Right. That is an assumption that was made by Frank Knight in 1921, that an economic man has perfect information. So we are taking this as an illustration. Now, if you are dealing with the issue of exaggeration, right, and then the caricaturing process, ladies and gentlemen, this cannot be specified just as lack of ignorance. When you talk about perfect information, economic man has, or having, an economic man having perfect information cannot be taken simply as lack of ignorance. For the model has to be fitted out with the descriptions of what that means, and this may be done in a variety of different positive ways. I hope you are following, ladies and gentlemen. We are taking an example of an assumption that Frank Knight made in 1921 that simply says that economic man has perfect information. Now, in the modeling process, right, we need to figure out what this means. So you cannot simply specify this as just a lack of ignorance. That, you know, you start modeling because, yes, no, that's not what it is. For the model has to be fitted out with the descriptions of what that means. And this can be done, ladies and gentlemen, in several ways. For example, one way to interpret the assumption of perfect knowledge is that such an economic man has no need of intelligence or power to reason. That's a possible interpretation that you can pick from it. When you talk about perfect information, right? Economic man has perfect information. That may actually mean that this economic man has no need of intelligence or power to reason. The other aspect is that this man, this economic man, can be interpreted to be a mechanical device responding to a stimuli. In other words, this man is actually a slot machine. And at this point, the caricature is less clear a representation of economic man as an idealization, isolation, or abstraction, but rather his character was constructed as a positive figure of science fiction, ladies and gentlemen. So, while idealization can still be understood as representation of the system or man's behavior, ladies and gentlemen, the more stylized models, the more these models get stylized, ladies and gentlemen, the less they can be considered as models of some specific systems or characters in the economy. So, as properties are added, just as you remember the process of modeling, right? You add, right? You add variables, you add, right, those particular constructs, and then, of course, remove to see that kind of effects. Now, as properties are added and attributed to the modeled entities and their behavior, the model starts to look like an intricate, perhaps fictional construction rather than an idealized representation of some real agents, ladies and gentlemen. So we need to be very careful. So taking heed of these problems, some economists, ladies and gentlemen, and philosophers have preferred to approach models as pure constructions rather than as idealizations from real world systems. So some economists prefer to take this element of modeling as pure constructions rather than looking at idealization of these models from the world system, ladies and gentlemen. So we look at models as constructions. So allow me now to take you to the second aspect, where we look at models as fictions and artificial systems, because we have introduced the issue of fiction. So a strong tradition in economics has understood economic models as fictions, able to give us some understanding of real economic mechanisms. And ladies and gentlemen, even though they are not interpreted as representations of the real target systems, these traditional economists consider economic modeling as a fiction, just able to give us some understanding of real economic systems. So this approach has also found supporters, right, and also found some bit of support among the philosophers of science in economics, as you can see. And another treatment of the role of fiction in economics, ladies and gentlemen, is given by an economist and philosopher, Fritz Matschlapp. And this is a scholar that who has contributed to the debate of the philosophy of economics, and is one of those scholars that we have actually discussed in the previous lectures. So this Fritz Matschlapp gives the role of fictions in economics, and he says that the role of fiction is very important because it guides methodological manipulations and helps us to understand the nature and the role of economic agents in the economic theory, ladies and gentlemen. So this Fritz Matschlapp suggests that Homo economicus should be regarded along with Weberian lines as an ideal type, by which he means that it is a mental construct, right? So when we start talking about the Homo economicus, right, then we relate this to the Weberian lines of an ideal type. And when you start dealing with ideal types, ladies and gentlemen, the Max Weber I gave you a few minutes ago, where you have those kind of exaggerations and so forth, it means that these things that you are looking at are actually mental constructs. And if they are mental constructs, then this becomes an artificial device for use in economic theorizing. So it's just artificial, and we simply use it in economic theorizing. So, and that's why at the end of the day, the name, right, of which should rather be, according to Weber, maybe should move from what we call the Homo economicus to Homunculus economicus, right? This is Homunculus or economicus. And of course, the implication here is that this indicates, and this is a man-made thing. So it has what we call man-made origins, ladies and gentlemen. And that's what Matschlapp 1978 says. So as an ideal type, Homo economicus has to be really distinguished from the real type, ladies and gentlemen. That's why economic theory, ladies and gentlemen, should be understood as a heuristic device for tracing the predicted actions of imagined agents to the imagined changes they face in their environment. So we see here that Matschlapp treats neoclassical firms likewise, and when he attempts to undertake his analysis, that's exactly what we say. So MATLAB treats classical farms here as really ideal types. And that's why MATLAB says they should not be taken to refer to real enterprises either. No. To him, these are just theoretical farms. They are actually fiction farms. Right? They are not real, but they help us really construct economic theories in this case. So that's why, according to the traditional price theory, that farm, right, as conceptualized by economists, is only a theoretical link that is designed to explain and predict changes in observed prices as effects of particular changes in the conditions, right, remain constant. And these, right, changes in the conditions, which are held constant, in terms of ceteris paribus, will include things like wage rates, interest rates, import duties, excise taxes, technology, etc., etc. But somehow these things are held constant, making the traditional price theory, right, concept of a farm as conceptualized by economists only a theoretical link, right, that is designed to explain certain things. Now, again, ladies and gentlemen, to confuse such an heuristic fiction with any reorganization, that's the real farms now, would be to commit the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, ladies and gentlemen. So, in other words, when we start talking about concrete, you see, you have the idealization and concretization, right? I know you abstract and then concretize. But in the traditional theory of a farm, what we call price theory, a farm, which is conceptualized by economists at that material time, is a theoretical link. In other words, it's a little bit abstract. It is fiction. So for us, we cannot confuse the fiction with any reorganization, and that's now real farms. And once you do so and attempt to confuse the two, then you are committing the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, because the issue of concrete is not there, ladies and gentlemen. So the justification for modeling farms in the way neoclassical micro theory does lies in the purpose for which the theory was constructed. So that's why you must understand that theory. What was the purpose for which the theory was constructed? And you need also to understand the assumptions that underlie such a theory and interrogate those assumptions. And if possible, we try to develop a much robust theory which is capable of critiquing after we have improved the development of such a theory, as we saw in the previous lectures, ladies and gentlemen. So, in explaining and predicting price behavior, only minimal assumptions concerning the behavior of the farm are needed. And if it is assumed to operate in an industry consisting of a large number of similar such enterprises, in such a situation, there is no need to talk about any internal decision making. Right, because most of the things are assumed constant. You're only varying one thing. Right, so you don't have to think about internal decision making, because a neoclassical farm, ladies and gentlemen, like a neoclassical consumer, just reacts to the constraints of the environment according to a pre-established behavior. In other words, maximizing principle. So, the fictional account of economic modeling contrasts with the realist interpretation of economic modeling. And that's why we go into the philosophy of science in economics, trying to look at those who have the realist perspective, right? Or philosophy, realist philosophy, and those who take the anti-realist philosophy, ladies and gentlemen. So that's why the fictional account of economic modeling contrasts with the realist interpretations of economic modeling, which certainly has been defended, especially by Cartwright and Mackey, and those are the people and the figures in the philosophy of science and economics that we have just considered a few minutes ago, ladies and gentlemen. So, the fictionalists' question, right, that we have to consider here is in terms of their values, in terms of what they question, and in terms of what they bring to the fore in terms of knowledge creation. Therefore, the fictionalists then question the realist assumptions that economists strive in their actual practice and not in their a posteriori methodological statements to make models represent the causally relevant factors of the real world. And then, of course, use deductive reasoning to work out what affects these factors. So it's very important for us to know how the abstraction process is done, and then in the process of abstraction, bring in the realist assumptions, which are very difficult to achieve at this level. So that's why, ladies and gentlemen, Robert Sugden, who is a theoretical economist himself, has claimed that this does not match the theorizing process of economists. And he uses Thomas Schelling's checkboard model of ratio sorting to launch his critique against the realist perspective, which assumes that although the assumptions in economics are usually very unrealistic, the operations of the isolated factors may and should be described correctly. So from this, we see Sugden claims that economic models should rather be regarded as constructions which, instead of being abstractions from reality, are parallel realities, ladies and gentlemen. So that's why fiction contrasts, right, at the outset with reality. So you'll find this contrast, right? And these contrasts are there, and they will be there. So fiction will contrast, and fiction contrasts with reality, right, which we take to exist quite apart from our representational endeavors. As individuals, we exist out there. We are real human beings. We are not objects. We are not slot machines, as some of the assumptions actually do suggest. We make decisions. And there are so many things that go on in our minds before decisions are made, right? Even firms, by the way, they are individuals, managers who must make decisions based on a number of theories, agency theories, and so forth. The interest of the stakeholders, if you use the stakeholder theory by Freeman, all those things are there, ladies and gentlemen. But certainly that's what it is. So that's why this shows why it is misleading to associate fiction with falsehood. Right. So fiction deals rather with the possible and the imaginary, with the non-actual states in general, which is the reason why the fictional mode is not limited to the literary realm, but can be extended to cover scientific accounts, ladies and gentlemen. So while fictionalists can be considered as constructionists at the same time or at the outset, they usually tend to stress the imaginary characteristics of models. And of course, this is at the center of our discussion and the debate that we must take on, ladies and gentlemen. So this is why it is very evident, particularly in the macroeconometric field, and often associated with Robert Lucas, who has famously written that one of the functions of theoretical economics is to provide fully articulated artificial economic systems that can serve as laboratories which policies that would be prohibitively expensive to experiment with in actual economics can be tested out to much lower cost. So according to what Lucas is presenting here, he seems to indicate that one of the functions of theoretical economics is to provide fully articulated artificial economic systems. So here artificial economic systems are used, and these artificial economic systems serve as laboratories in which policies, which are a little bit difficult to achieve and undertake and experiment with in the natural setting, can actually help us come up with certain things that can serve as reality out there. So as you can see here, to serve this function very well, it is essential that the artificial model economy that economists use to, well, that artificial economy model that economists usually come up with can be distinguished as sharply as possible in discussion with the actual and real economies that exist out there. So you may have an artificial economy, but you also have a real economy existing. So you have these two models parallel to one another, but somehow you use the artificial one to be able to simulate a few things can actually suit the real economy, the other side. So that's why a theory is not a collection of assertions about behavior of the actual economy, but rather an explicit set of instructions for building a parallel or analog system, which is really a mechanical imitation economy in this case. Now, if you recall, whereas this is what we pick from literature as, again, presented by Lucas, I did tell you in our previous lectures that when you start talking about a theory, I know you can have those complicated definitions of what a theory is. No, we are saying you have a net that you are able to cast out there, and when you cast that net out there, you are able to capture as much reality as possible, and getting a model at that level is not very easy. But you see, in economic thinking, given what most economists have been doing over time, then for them, they look at a theory in terms of really assertions and behavior, and they look at a theory in terms of really an artificial kind of model that can resemble the reality out there, ladies and gentlemen. So it's important for us to consider this, and that's why we know a good model from this point of view will not be exactly more real than a poor one, but will provide better imitations. So in our case, better explanations of that reality. So whereas Cartwright has models which he uses as blueprints for nomological machines that might exist in the real world, Lucas has theories as blueprints for building models that might mimic the world. And that's their point of departure. Lucas and Cartwright have a debate that is worth interrogating, ladies and gentlemen. So I want to invite you during your free time to interrogate this debate, because Cartwright has models. He looks at models. So for him, a theory, for her, a model can be looked at as a blueprint for nomological machines that might exist in the world. But according to Lucas, these theories are actually blueprints. So it's the theories who are blueprints for building models that might mimic the world. So you use theories to build models that mimic the world. Now, Cartwright simply says models, right, are important, and they are used as blueprints for nomological machines. So I think you can see the controversy between this debate. So this constructivist, ladies and gentlemen, the constructivist move transforms the relation between models and theory. For now, the task of the theory is to produce models as analogous of the world, rather than to use them to understand how the world works, ladies and gentlemen. So these are very important things, and this move is important for us to interrogate because the move also transforms the sense of how theories or models are supposed to fit to the world, namely to the notion of that such analog world models can be fitted by calibration to particular data set characteristics or even looking at parameter estimations and statistical inferences that we do take at the end of the day. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to move to constructed representations. Because we are dealing with the constructions, right? Now, just to remind you, possibly, you may have forgotten where we started from, and yet we need to remind ourselves what we are doing so that we do not get lost at the end of the day. I told you that we are looking at models as constructions, and at this level, we deal with the ideal types and the caricatures, and we've really gone through that. Two, we've looked at fictions and artificial systems, ladies and gentlemen. And now we are moving to the third element, constructed representations. And then we shall end with the models as autonomous objects. So we are more or less close to the end of this lecture, ladies and gentlemen. So I hope you are not very tired, ladies and gentlemen, because the debate can be tiring. But I'm just inviting you to join the debate, right? Because the debate is quite interesting. So we'll go now to the third debate of constructed representations. So many economists think of constructing their models expressly to represent certain possible stylized aspects of economics, right? And such constructivist accounts of models pay specific attention to the various elements of models, as well as to the means of representation and the role of tractability, ladies and gentlemen. Now, the problems of tractability in this case suggest that increasing realisticness in some aspects of the representations will have to be traded off against the simplification and the distortions. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, as Sternbergen recognized right from the start of modeling in economics, in order to be realistic, the model has to assume a great number of elementary equations and variables. In order to be workable, it should assume a small number of them. So as you can see in this case, when you look at models as constructions, the element of reality comes out very well. Realism. To what extent can we say that our construction is real? Our construction is very close to reality out there. And that our modeling process will produce results that approximate the results to what we see out there. In other words, seeing that model fit the reality so that at the end of the day, your model can be considered as a theory. Right, and that's the argument between Cartwright, as we saw, and Lucas, ladies and gentlemen. So, the increasing realisticness in various aspects of the representation, ladies and gentlemen, which has to be traded off against simplification and distortion, is of major concern to researchers. And more so, what we call the philosophers in economics, that the philosophers of science in the area of economics. So that's why, ladies and gentlemen, as we saw from the start in the modeling process, right, we need to be realistic. But in order to be realistic, the model has to assume a great number of elementary equations and variables. So even the models that you have, the statistical modeling, econometric modeling that you go through, all those things that includes the linear structure relations, because you must have too many variables, you must have too many equations that must be included in the system. So that's why you have linear structure relations, right? And having so many levels of abstraction, starting from a level of a concept, right, and building up the argument to a construct, ladies and gentlemen, and we have already gone through those things. So by the time we come to this state, right, yes, you want to be realistic. You have too many of them. But at the end of the day, in order to be workable, it should assume a smaller number of variables, ladies and gentlemen. So you can see there's a debate, right? And that's why as young researchers, doctoral researchers, you must be humble. You must humble yourselves, because most of the things that you think are probably right, they may not be right incidentally. So we can also interrogate your ideas and dismiss them. So when you see people accepting your PhD dissertation, it's not because it is correct, and not because it is wrong, but it's because the scholars think that I think you have reached a level where you are able also to do independent research and contribute to knowledge, right? And also contribute to the ongoing debates that we see in literature. So that's why you should not be very, very proud. So striving to combine, ladies and gentlemen, such diverse elements that we have talked about to one another in a particular model tells us something interesting about modeling. It simply tells you that you need the skill of modeling. It simply tells you that you need that experience in modeling. Right? It also tells you that there is a hard work that is required to make a new model, ladies and gentlemen. So that's why here the image of scientist as a modeler is very different from that of a theoretical thinker, right? And this is very important. In fact, Bowman likens model construction to baking a cake, right, without a recipe. And according to Bowman, right, economic models are constructed from various ingredients, including theoretical relations and statistical elements, right? And as we have already seen right, with an objective of explaining reality out there. So you can imagine, right, you interrogate a theory, you pick specific metaphors that represent reality out there, right? And then you go ahead and start discussing these things, right, ladies and gentlemen, because there's another statistical component to it. So, but again, as I told you, right, within the field of economics, you have got two streams, or two categories of scholars. Those who have taken the mathematical bit and the others who have taken the econometric bit, who draw their inspiration from statistics, ladies and gentlemen. Right, but as we have already seen, right, the mathematical economic models are also constructed in a similar manner, right? And of course, as you can see, once we say that, you might get surprised because this is a more surprising claim, ladies and gentlemen. But yet, these mixtures are equally characteristic in mathematical models, as Bowman has already noted in this case. So mathematics plays the critical role of molding these various different ingredients into the model. So at some stage, you've got that intersection between statistics and mathematics, right? And it's very important and a very useful kind of knowledge that you must utilize. So that's why Bowman argues that new recipes, right, are created. They are then adapted, right, and then adopted to new circumstances. And of course, at the end of the day, you question what you've come up with to form a new sequence, right, of interrelated relationships that explains reality out there, ladies and gentlemen. So that's why we pick from the ideas of Koopman, right? And Koopman gives us very important suggestions here that this sequence that we are talking about is related to modeling, and it's more like a kinship table. And you know what a kinship kind of thing is, right? Kinship. So you find this one is related to this one is related to this, and this kind of thing. Right. I can give you an example, ladies and gentlemen, before we come to the end, because I'll be coming to the end very soon. So what we are discussing here can easily be related to what we see in economics, generally speaking, right? So this account that we are talking about nicely captures the ways in which some models, such as the vulnerable ISLM models in macroeconomics, right, experience an incredibly long life in which they are adapted to represent new theories which are used to analyze new problems and generally reinterpret. So if you're going to look at the ISLM models, ladies and gentlemen, the kind of thing that economists go through in the modeling process is similar to what Bowman argues to be related to baking a cake without a recipe. In which case, ladies and gentlemen, new recipes in this case are created, they are adapted, they are adopted to new circumstances, and then you continue, right, questioning whatever you've done so that you form something that gives you a sequence that you can relate to models that are rather more like a kinship table, ladies and gentlemen. So when we go to ILS, not ILS, but ISLM model, ladies and gentlemen, that's exactly what happens, because they take time. These models take time, right? And so they really experience an incredibly long life, right? They're adapted to represent new theories, analyze new problems, and those are reinterpreted, right? For some of you who are not very familiar, I can remind you what the ISLM model is all about. So the ISLM model stands for investment savings and liquidity preference money supply, ladies and gentlemen. So the investment savings and liquidity preference money supply model is a Keynesian microeconomic model that shows how the market for economic goods interacts with the loanable funds market, or what we call the money market. And that's your LM in this case. So the history of modeling strongly suggests, ladies and gentlemen, that such constructed model sequences are as much driven by changes in the purposes of models as by the changes in theories. So as you can see, a model can both enable, ladies and gentlemen, and a model can also constrain. A model can enable and a model can constrain, just like the ISLM model that I've just given you, the investment saving and liquidity preference money supply, the ISLM model. And that's the Keynesian macroeconomic model, right? And simply shows how the market for economic goods interacts with the loanable funds market. And that's the money market, ladies and gentlemen. So that's what we see. And that's a very nice model, by the way. And this model here can be used as a good example of how a model can both enable and constrain. Right, the ISLM model is a very good example of a model that can enable and at the same time constrain. So the most famous of several contemporary attempts to model the key assumptions of Keynesians, the general theory of employment, interest, and money. Now, this model could be used to demonstrate some of Keynes' most important conclusions, yet at the same time it omitted many important features of his theory, leading some economists to distinguish between the economics of Keynes and the Keynesian economics. So when you go to the literature, you'll find scholars who have taken one perspective and they are talking about the economics of Keynes, and others have also taken on another form to start discussing the Keynesian economics. And this is an example where a model can enable and a model can constrain at the same time. So consequently, ladies and gentlemen, modelers typically proceed by turning these kinds of constraints built into models. So you can put these things there, right? And at the end of the day, they can form what we call affordances. And this is very, very correct and particularly evident in analogical modeling, where the artifactual constraints of both content and model language may hold inflexibly, ladies and gentlemen. So, of course, whether the model is an analogical one or not, ladies and gentlemen, scientists use their models in such a way that they can gain understanding. And at the end of the day, help you draw inferences from manipulating their models by using its constraints, not just its resources to their advantage. So that's why it is very important. So in this, it is this kind of ongoing process in modeling, it is this experimental dimension of models that accounts for how models have the power in use to fulfill so many different epistemic functions. Remember, we deal with the issues of knowledge. So ladies and gentlemen, let's now go to the last part, right, of looking at models, right, as construction. So another aspect of construction element of the model is the autonomy objects, autonomous objects, right? So we can look at models, ladies and gentlemen, as autonomous objects, right? Remember I told you earlier on that you see, models have been looked at in different ways, right? Some people will look at a mathematical equation or expression and they say that's a model. Other people look at a diagram, right, and they will say that's a model, while others will look at something that is constructed to represent reality out there as a model. And in fact, all those perspectives are correct, ladies and gentlemen. So we are only looking at different forms now. Models can be seen as autonomous objects. From a naturalist philosophy of science viewpoint, right? Remember, ladies and gentlemen, there's a naturalist philosophy of science, right? So from that naturalist philosophy of science perspective, right, they usually, especially these who hold that thinking, right, from that viewpoint, ladies and gentlemen, the way the economists work with models suggests that they are regarded and so may be understood as autonomous working objects. The way most economists, right, handle models and work with models, we can easily conclude that models are autonomous objects. Now, in our previous discussions, the constructedness of models was seen, ladies and gentlemen, in terms of the assumed real or imaginary target systems. You also remember that the independent nature of models can fruitfully be considered from the perspectives of theory and data. And I've been talking about reality out there, if you recall. So, without doubt, ladies and gentlemen, many models are rather renderings of theories that any target systems and some are considered as proto-theories, not having yet the status of theory. So on the other hand, econometric model have at times been considered as a version of data. And in a more recent account, economic models are understood to be constructed out of elements of both theory and the world or its data, and thus able to function with a certain degree of independence from both. Now, the divide between theoretical models and econometric models, ladies and gentlemen, seem to be a little bit misleading, since from the perspective on model construction, both kinds of models are heterogeneous ensembles of diverse elements. So, models act as instruments that enable the scientists to learn about the world or about their theories, ladies and gentlemen. And this depends not only on their functional independence built in at the construction stage of these models, but on rather construction feature, namely models are devices made to represent something in the world out there, or some part of our theory, or perhaps both at once. That is, if you are using theory to explain practice out there, ladies and gentlemen. So these two features that I've just given you, ladies and gentlemen, function independence, right? So they bring this element of function independence. So there is that element of independence that these models, right, the features that we have just seen tell us that there is that element of function, right? So models will be able to function independent of what is happening out there. But of course, the second element is representation of reality and the quality of representation that is usually loosely defined. And this makes it possible to use models as epistemic mediators, ladies and gentlemen. So these aspects are very important in the modeling process, and then we cannot really ignore what we are doing, ladies and gentlemen. So as we are coming to the close of this lecture, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to remind you a few things if you did not pick them. We did say that really models can be seen as, of course, those particular things that represent reality out there, right? But even then, since they are constructions of reality, even the artificial world models, right? The artificial world models of Lucas, remember I gave you Lucas, which are constructed as analogs to represent outputs of the system, not the behavior of the system, can be understood under this account, though their functions in investigations may be more limited. In this sense, ladies and gentlemen, models which are looked at as mediators take also a mediating view in respect to the models as idealizations versus the models as constructions. So that divide will be there, idealization versus models being seen as constructions. So can we go through idealization, de-idealization, and then, of course, concreteness, ladies and gentlemen. So as you can see, that process of idealization versus the models as constructions, that divide itself, of course, partly an idealization made up of expository reasons, right? And those reasons must be there, since it takes a liberal attitude, both as to what models are supposed to represent, ladies and gentlemen, and also to the mode of their making via idealization and the idealization of via a process of construction, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you very much for having attended this lecture. Right, and I want to remind you the topic that we have been discussing. The topic we've been discussing is models and modeling in economics. Don't forget, we are dealing with models and modeling in economics. So so far, we have covered 2 lectures, and we are remaining with one more lecture, ladies and gentlemen, to complete this topic of models and modeling in economics. So 3 lectures will be enough for us to complete this, right? Now, if you recall, in our first lecture, we covered introduction and nature of economic models. And by the way, when I say our first lecture, ladies and gentlemen, I really mean lecture 13. Lecture 13 is where we covered that part, and the second lecture of that is actually lecture 14. So in lecture 13, ladies and gentlemen, if you recall, I introduced the issue of economics and modeling. I looked at the nature of economic models, ladies and gentlemen, and in lecture 13, we also covered models as idealizations. So we covered the idealization and de-idealization. I also covered the idealization versus de-idealization debate in econometrics. Lecture 14 has taken us to models as constructions, and models as constructions. We've discussed ideal types and caricatures. And we've also discussed fictions and artificial systems, and we've also discussed constructed representations, and I've looked at models as autonomous objects, ladies and gentlemen. So in the last lecture, which will be our lecture 15, we shall continue with the debate on this, but we shall be discussing working with models in terms of representation, in terms of instruments and narratives. We shall also have an opportunity to look at models and their epistemic functions. So when we go into epistemic functions, models, the epistemic functions in terms of experimental exploration, in terms of conceptual exploration, and in terms of inferences from models, and then we shall be able to close. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for having the second part of this lecture of models and modeling in economics. I wish you a nice time. I can only say stay home, stay safe, and we meet in lecture 15. Have a nice time. Bye.